I tell you what,
It's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jay.
And today we are talking about a few Roald Dahl adaptations, mainly the 1990 movie The Witches, because that's really the only one that we have deemed worth having on DVD and watching over and over. I seem to remember being read The Witches by our mum when we were on holiday and enjoying it very much, and it can't have been long after that the movie was released. It stars Angelica Houston as the Grand High Witch, who, unlike in the book, has an alias, Miss Ernst. Jason Fisher is the boy, the narrator, who doesn't have any name in the book, but of course in the film he has to have a name, and it's Luke. It's a good adaptation, in my opinion. A fairly faithful adaptation, does a few of its own things, many of which are good things, some of which are bad things, some of which are just things, I think. To get the bad things out of the way, there's a certain amount of unnecessary jeopardy, such as when Luke is a mouse putting the mouse formula into the witch's soup and nearly overbalancing the ladle and falling in, getting chased by the cat when he's going to steal the witch's formula, although having a couple of cats hanging about with the witches is in itself a nice touch. It's not something that Roald Dahl mentioned, probably thought they didn't really have familiars because they're not like the traditional witches that we will have read about before, but I think it's a nice thing in the film. Chasing Luke out of the function room and all around the hotel and messing about outside, the Grand High Witch pushing a baby's pram down the cliff so he has to save it from falling into the sea, and one or two witches visibly reacting with pleasure to seeing this happen, is something that witches do not do according to the book, and it's implied in the film as well. If you don't mind getting caught. And then there's the ending where Jane Horrocks, playing the Grand High Witch's secretary, which isn't a bad addition in itself, without any particular precedent or build-up, suddenly turning up in a convertible car, changing Luke back from a mouse, being told, "Don't forget Bruno," returning Luke's glasses, which also she's mended because they got stepped on, and William and Mary, his two pet mice. It's rather abrupt, a fix-all without any kind of preamble, and very much against Roald Dahl's vision for the whole thing and his ending of Luke and Grandma in the film, going round as an old lady and a mouse, turning the witches of the world into mice with their own Grand High Witch's formula. However, I do think it's not a bad idea to restore the status quo, mice to humans, if they were humans in the first place, for the end of a Hollywood movie. It's just the way it's done is rather awkward.
I was thinking while we were watching it just now, actually, it was managing to get some successful comedy out of some of the stuff that Roald Dahl wrote, and also some successful comedy out of its own additions. I think particularly of the bit where Grandma takes Bruno in her handbag to reunite him with the parents. A lot of that is Roald Dahl's dialogue transplanted into the film, made very funny by Mai Zetterling as Grandma. You can see exactly why Mr. Jenkins believes her to be a nutter and a loony as a result of this exchange. Another funny scene with Mr. Jenkins is something added especially for the film, where he's talking to the Grand High Witch about charity work. She's showing that her cover of being the leader of the RSPCC isn't something that's always on her mind, and it really should be, if witches are so concerned with staying out of the public eye. Again, it's the same problem, as you were saying, as we experienced with that stupid protracted chase sequence. But it does make a very funny scene. What is this RSPCC? It's supposed to be her charity, fellow philanthropist. You collect stamps. That always used to make us laugh, and it still does.
Jane Horrocks is useful there for whispering whispering to her cruelty to children, reminding her of their cover.
And it's no coincidence that Mr. Jenkins is in those two funny bits. He's very amusing in the film. The actor's called Bill Patterson, a real Scot. And he does lots of funny background things like complaining about the tea trolley and the pictures in the hotel brochure, and he's so ghastly. You can see why his wife, Bruno's mum, played by Brenda Blethyn, absolutely hates him. Nice little touches like that to build on what Roald Dahl wrote, flesh out the world that the story is taking place in.
They do a lot of mixing up the characters in the hotel, which Roald Dahl doesn't really go in for.
It no longer surprises me reading the book The Witches or listening to the audiobook when we don't actually meet Bruno until he turns up at the witches' meeting, and the narrator then fills us in on. I'd seen him before in the hotel.
Bruno's father also has a conversation with Mr. Stringer, who's played very amusingly by Rowan Atkinson. Roald Dahl wrote set in the manager Mr. Stringer's office rather than narrator and grandmama's hotel room where it's set in the film. Mr. Stringer saying that Luke, the boy, isn't allowed his pet mice in the hotel, and grandma saying there are rats in the hotel, she's going to call the public health authority, and there's a lot of dialogue from that scene directly transplanted. Rowan Atkinson saying, "You can't be serious, madam," in a way that you probably wouldn't read it from the Mr. Stringer in the book, but he gives a very funny interpretation. But in the book, you don't see him interact with Bruno's father. In the film, you do, for another bit of that unnecessary jeopardy. Bruno's father is about to eat the soup too, and he has to persuade Mr. Stringer that he doesn't want the soup on the menu. He doesn't want cock-a-leekie. He doesn't like cock-a-leekie. He likes cress, which of course is the one that Luke has put the mouse formula into. Also, during the witches' meeting, which Roald Dahl wrote, the Grand High Witch blows up as an example to keep the other witches in order. Somebody who has unwisely made the remark, "We can't possibly wipe out all of them." We cut to Mr. Stringer and an extra who we see a couple of times at reception. She's the one who's getting told by Mr. Jenkins, whoever took the pictures for the brochure should be arrested for fraud. They're getting a wind and light flicker and reacting to this, and Rowan Atkinson saying, "What the devil?" and all that kind of thing brings the life in the hotel together in a way that it isn't in the book. It's all rather separate and brought up as Roald Dahl needs it for the plot.
Rowan Atkinson is incredibly amusing in that film, just like he is in everything, and he is very accessible for the younger audience. The way he looks at Luke with such loathing and distaste as soon as he finds out about William and Mary and sees Luke round the place. His reply to Grandma saying about the dustpan and brush, "It's lovely, isn't it? Red." The way Rowan Atkinson says yes, red, always absolutely killed us laughing. A very particular skill Rowan Atkinson has to make a line as simple as that sound funny, and an exchange like that become as comedic as it possibly can.
Similar to mixing up the people in the hotel is to show us the witch who tried to lure Luke down from his treehouse in the hotel at the witches' meeting, taking off her wig and her gloves, saying a few things there. In the book, the narrator says, "I couldn't see the witch who tried to get me out of my treehouse, but it only makes sense that she'd be there, and they're quite right to show her to us in the film." Another funny thing they do with Mr. Stringer is have him be clearly at it behind the scenes with one of the chambermaids. Not the witch chambermaid. In fact, there are 2 witches working in the hotel, which is possibly excessive. One is a good idea, and she locks up after Mr. Stringer leaves the witches' meeting. The witch chambermaid isn't in the book, but this other one is, finding Luke's mice and telling on him to Mr. Stringer. But there's absolutely no implication that she and Mr. Stringer are lovers, whereas in the film it's something that is woven in and out of the narrative. She's screaming at Luke when he's snuck onto her cleaning trolley, and the witch chambermaid wants to know, is she sober? And Rowan Atkinson saying, "Yes, of course, I've been with her all I saw her. Yes, she's sober." Very funny. Bruno is also played by a child, of course, an English child called Charlie Potter. In the film, when Luke meets Bruno, Bruno is nibbling cakes around the edge because there's raisins all around them, which Luke is then able to reference when trying to convince Mr. Stringer that Grandma will call the public health authority because of the rats. And he asks, "How much pocket money do you get? My dad's rich, but he's very tight. We've got 3 cars," he says, a little bit flexing and bragging there. But that's really the worst of him in the film. And when they're both mice and Luke takes Bruno up to Grandmama to get them both some immediate assistance, and later she'll attempt to take him back to his parents, he's perfectly polite and they say a nice goodbye, still as mice, when they part ways in the hotel. Bruno's one of those characters who is made much less objectionable for a Hollywood film. In the book, after telling us that Bruno has walked into the function room to show the witches how he gets turned into a mouse after having the mouse maker, the narrator tells us he found him burning ants with a magnifying glass, and he frequently boasts about how rich his father is. But I think it's nicer for a film to have Bruno be somebody who has his faults, but basically a decent person who we like and who we're rooting for, and who we want to see return to the bosom of his family, although the Grand High Witch might be right. She's done Bruno a service, turning him into a mouse with a father like that. But then, of course, the last time we see Mr. Jenkins, he's trying to calm down Mrs. Jenkins and saying to her, "This is our Bruno," so he loves him after all, and maybe having a mouse for a son for a day or so before Jane Horrocks comes along will improve him. As you said, Mrs. Jenkins hates Mr. Jenkins, and we see this rather like Mr. Stringer with his evils that he gives Luke. She keeps giving him evils when he's talking to, in a way, kind of chatting up Miss Ernst. When he's demanding press soup from Mr. Stringer, she's giving him these looks. "Why did I marry you? You're awful." Not something directly inspired by Roald Dahl. Mrs. Jenkins is rather a non-entity in the book. Now shall we talk about the effects? Rather like Tina Majorino's Alice in Wonderland that we've talked about. Exactly like it, in fact. They make use of Jim Henson's Creature Workshop for this production, and Jim Henson's Creature Workshop can always be relied upon to create good creatures and effects. Bruno, who had brown hair as a boy, is a brown mouse, and Luke, who had blonde hair as a boy, is a blonde mouse. And they managed to find a very obliging real blonde mouse to do the running around and jumping around and dragging the bottle of formula along in his tail, dropping it into the soup off that ladle I mentioned earlier. It's very good at acting, that mouse. It reminded me, when we watched it today, of Salem in Sabrina the Teenage Witch. There will be a real animal doing the leg work, and particularly when an actor picks up the real animal and puts it down, and then it cuts to the puppet. They also found, for when the witches all become mice at the end, some nice black and white ones. There are about 100 witches, 80-something it says in the book, and you get the impression that all of them are these black and white mice, but only a few are in shot at the time, of course.
I think the order for cress soup is confirmed as 80-something in the film, just to prove that that does match up with the book.
There are no Jim Henson black and white mice, they're not needed, but there are 3 stages of Grand High Witch from Jim Henson. The very elaborate, horrible, hideous, full head and shoulders and back and chest mask that Angelica Houston wears, which I, as a child, used to find very amusing as a bit of irony that Angelica Houston wears all this mask that in the movie is her real body, and in the movie Angelica Houston's real face is dramatically a mask. And that's very well done, very effective, clearly inspired by Roald Dahl's description of the Grand High Witch's face. And then, towards the end, when all the witches are getting changed into mice, there's a kind of halfway to being a mouse puppet, which looks kind of like the mask, which is her real face, but more mouse-shaped. And then when she isn't mouse, she is a particularly ugly, entirely bald one who rants underneath the jug where Grandma traps it. And, of course, you need a puppet for that. When Grandmama tells Mr. Stringer that it's particularly infectious, I'm sure he can well believe it as he goes to kill it with his meat cleaver. Combining these effects and the acting and the children, particularly Jason, doing talking and breaths and efforts over the real mice as well as voicing the puppets is all very effective.
It was interesting just now to take a close look at the list of puppeteers. Brian Henson and Steve Whitmire obviously came over from America to do this movie. Steve Whitmire at the time, of course, very much a part of the Muppet team, but not having taken over the role of Kermit yet, as Jim Henson was still around. There were a few puppeteer names we didn't particularly recognise, but there were some definitely English puppeteers who were on board with Jim Henson's Creature Workshop for this movie, filmed almost entirely in England. Certainly all the bits of puppetry were filmed in England. There was Don Austin, who we know from his partnership with fellow puppeteer John Eccleston, doing Sage and Onion on Live and Kicking, and Bro on Wolfit. Anthony Asbury, who is actually American, but whose career as a puppeteer has taken place entirely in England. He puppeteered and voiced Madison, the parrot, in Harry's Mad on CITV, which is a show we have referenced before on these podcasts.
Only a few years ago, at the time of recording, there was a new adaptation of The Witches, which I hope someday to tell you my opinion of. The other Roald Dahl film that we used to watch and have a recording off the telly of is the BFG, the animated movie from Cosgrove Hall from Christmas 1989. That is a good film, I think, and Brian Cosgrove was telling us it was the first time that Roald Dahl had allowed anyone to adapt his work since Willy, Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and they were all rather nervous, and at this screening where Roald Dahl had seen the film at the end, he apparently gave it a standing ovation and everyone was very pleased. There's something missing, which is the humour. The giants, besides the BFG being humorous as well as threatening, you really don't get that.
That really is what's missing from that. Some of the more poignant bits are the strengths of it. Goodbye, human beings, says David Jason as the BFG at the end. You can always rely on David Jason to do a very stimulating and appropriate voice performance, particularly Cosgrove Hall always relied on him to do that, and they were right to do so. It's the final role of Ballard Berkeley from Fawlty Towers as the head of the army. Also Angela Thorne from such productions as Elizabeth R. and To the Manor Born as the voice of Queen Elizabeth II. Certainly does the best job I think anyone could possibly do voicing Queen Elizabeth II in a movie like that, not as like a joke like on Spitting Image. Don Henderson as the Blood Bottler and the Flesh Thump Eater. The other evil giants don't have any lines. It's very striking, and that's a very appropriate use of his voice. He's one of these very deep-voiced people who, it turns out, have died of throat cancer in the end. Another one being Ed Gilbert, who played, amongst many other roles, Shaman and 3030 on Bravestar. Other places Don Henderson has used that voice that we've seen several times on video include Tommy Brock in Beatrix Potter the Animated Tales, and as a simulant in Red Dwarf 7. And I think for those two man-eating, bloodthirsty, evil giants, that's the best use of Don Henderson's particular voice that I've ever heard.
And the lady playing Sophie is called Amanda Root, and a jolly good job she does as well. Roald Dahl liked that movie despite the changes that they made, and the changes that they did make are very much movie things, narrative, structural things. And some of those I approve of. And when I read the book, I think, oh, well, that was better in the film, really. And I'm specifically thinking there of his dream mixing that the BFG does. We see him mixing dreams together to make a story before Sophie has the idea of giving the Queen a dream to tell her about the giants and herself and the BFG as well to make her believe it. In the book, he's giving the children the dreams as they are, and Sophie says, well, can you make the person dream this or that? He says, oh, yes, I'd have to mix dreams together. It works very well, I think, to see him saying, well, these bits of dream don't make sense on their own. We have to make all of them into a story before we can give them to the children. Also, that personal journey that you were touching upon, no longer calling them human beings, but human beings, is kind of symbolic of how he's come to realise that there's more to us as a species than he thinks, that we're not all rock squibblers or whatever he calls us. Some of them is very brave, he says, when the army and the air force are coming to truss up the giants and fly them to a pit at their own risk. In the book, you get the flesh lump eater waking up and having to be tricked into clutching his ankle because the BFG's convinced him he's been bitten by a venomous windscreen viper for a little bit of jeopardy just at the climax there. In the film, that becomes a huge thing where he's not even there and they're counting them, saying, oh, there's only 8. He says there were 9. And then there's the roar of the flesh lump eater. And he says accusingly to the BFG, you showed them the way. You was not like giant. You was more like human being. And the BFG saying, yes, I'd rather be like one of them than one of you. It's not something that's gone into or even really implied in the book, but it's very effective for the film. Then says the flesh lump eater, I kill you, because there's been this whole thing about how giants is never killing other giants, and it all fits together very well structurally. And then Sophie saves the BFG's life by distracting the flesh lump eater, and he's trying to shake her out of this kind of network of tunnels in the BFG's table. Then he comes along with his Trogglehumper nightmare about Jack with his beanstalk. In the book, he's spike-sticking me with his beanstalk, which is the sort of humour that is omitted from the film, which is inspired by an earlier scene in the book where the flesh lump eater is asleep and the BFG gives him the Trogglehumper just for a laugh, which makes more sense, actually, for him to have this nightmare while he's asleep. But in the film, it wraps up that structure and that saving each other and the BFG realising how much better than giants human beings are.
Because you is evil, he says to the flesh lump eater in response to, why did you show them the way? And I seize that now. More great work from David Jason.
They can. Those two actors do that funny talking and make it sound extremely serious and poignant.
That part about a Trogglehumper for the flesh lump eater being relocated to the end to be more relevant to the plot, despite making less sense because he's not asleep at the time, is not the only sort of throwaway bit from elsewhere in the story that gets turned into the denouement. That thing about you is not giant, you is like human being, then I kill you, is based on in the book. The BFG goes down into the pit to untie them, and it's only then the giants realise the BFG caused all these problems. In that case, we is guzzling you instead. The BFG pulled the rope to be taken out of the pit pretty darn quickly. A throwaway moment, as I said, but really made the most of in the animated movie. And yes, you can see why that is a good idea for a film adaptation. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is a Hollywood movie from 1971, and it certainly doesn't surprise either of us that Roald Dahl refused to allow any adaptation rights after it was made, because it really is an abomination of his work, even if there are certain things that are overall popular about it.
The interpretation of Willy Wonka by Gene Wilder is pretty good, actually. They dress him as Roald Dahl describes him, and he is very warm and fun, which is probably a good idea for the screen, not quite so eccentric as in the book, and I think he does come across very well. the children who win the golden tickets and go to the factory with Charlie, and their fatal flaws are pretty well realised, I think, too. And the things that they do take directly from the book to do with the plot and the characterisation are very good. The problem, not unlike the witches really, but to a far greater extent, is when they do their own thing, their own spin that they put on it. What sticks with me chiefly is the children are tasked with stealing a gobstopper, ostensibly for a rival chocolatier, but actually this is a test of chivalry. And Charlie is the child that passes this test of chivalry, and it's a bit like, well then what's the point of Veruca going down the garbage chute and Mike TV getting shrunk and Augustus Gloop falling in the chocolate river and Violet Beauregard getting turned into a giant blueberry if they were going to do sabotage and show themselves up as bad children in that way. And on top of that, Charlie has been persuaded by Grandpa Joe to do exactly the same kind of thing, steal fizzy lifting drinks, and they very nearly get mangled in the ceiling fans, which is exactly what should happen to you if you steal fizzy lifting drinks, and are able to save themselves by burping, which is a silly sequence anyway, but really the point is it goes against the whole message, ideology, narrative that the story is supposed to be giving us.
The adaptation of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory from 2005 is much more true to the book in many ways, although the interpretation of Willy Wonka is much further from the book and also much stupider, as is the inclusion of Christopher Lee as his dentist father. And of course Freddie Highmore as Charlie is completely nauseating in that movie. We've explained before what Freddie Highmore was put on this earth for, and that was to imitate Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates, which he did for 5 years, so now there's absolutely no point in him anymore.
There are good things about that movie. It is able to recreate on the screen what Roald Dahl said happened to Veruca with the squirrels and testing for bad nuts, and Veruca's a bad nut, whereas in the 70s they couldn't create that effect and had geese laying eggs, golden chocolate eggs, that would go down the garbage chute if they're rotten, and Veruca was a rotten egg, which I think is not an unreasonable thing to do with the idea when you've got limited effects. But it was good to see it with the squirrels, and those other 4 children are all cast, characterised very well. Mike TV and Violet Beauregard have flaws that a modern audience probably wouldn't accept as totally unreasonable. Violet chewing gum the whole time, and Mike TV watching a lot of television, and they kind of adapt them, add to them. Violet's gum chewing is competitive, she's overly competitive. Mike TV doesn't just watch TV, he does games consoles and whatever the technology was at the time to excess, and is in his own world and rude to people who ever manage to penetrate it. And there's a very nice shot of all the children and their one adult, which is a good idea. Roald Dahl says that they will bring both parents. They dress and hair and make up them all to look very effective, standing outside the factory, waiting to be let in. Anna Sophia, Rob chewing away. And when they're doing the story of what's in the book, it's okay, it's pretty good. Deep Roy as all the Oompa Loompas is quite effective too, I think. But then its flaws are massive and unforgivable and render the whole thing unwatchable after a few times. I read that there had been some doubt as to whether people were going to go for Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow and if it was too weird. And then when everybody loved him, Tim Burton said to Johnny Depp, "Oh, you do what you want, you make Willy Wonka weird as you like." And I don't think Johnny Depp has read the book and is familiar with the character, and thought what he was doing with this incredibly unhinged, rather standoffish Willy Wonka would amuse everybody, but pretty much everybody thought it was very unsuccessful.
I remember watching the opening for the first time with the looming chocolate bar stamping machine and thinking, oh God, this must be Tim Burton. What are they let Tim Burton all over this for? And yeah, I think it probably would be better without him and Johnny Depp.
The one other Roald Dahl adaptation I've seen a few times, and so have you, that's worth talking about at all is Matilda, which was released in 1996 and in fact we saw in the cinema. And that too is an interesting and I think fairly successful mix of directly taking events, actual lines of dialogue from the book, and mixing in bits and pieces that I think would be good in a movie.
I've always thought it's a pretty good attempt to transplant the story of Matilda and the characters to America, a large American city. Danny DeVito is very entertaining in it, also Pam Ferris. Rhea Perlman, Danny DeVito's real-life wife. Cheers mainstay plays her part as well, as does Mara Wilson of Mrs. Doubtfire fame.
That makes a rather drastic change to the ending, in the sense that Matilda still has her telekinesis, whereas in the book she can't do it anymore. She's sent up to year 6, even though she's only about 5, and is challenged in school and not tapping these reserves in her brain any longer. Is that a drastic change? I thought it was a big one anyway. What we didn't mention is that the BFG also makes rather a drastic change. The BFG in the film doesn't go to live in the human world. He goes back to Giant Country because he has his dreams to blow, even though you go and get them from Dream Country. And in the book he's still doing that anyway and getting letters from children asking for particular dreams. But they thought it would be more poignant for him to go back to Giant Country and for Sophie to be crying and say, I wanted to be with him always. Does you, Sophie? So, whether they take it a bit too far with estranged fathers and gobstopper sabotage or not, these movies don't seem to like Roald Dahl's endings very much.
Our next release will be with you quite soon, sometime in January, and it will be an update podcast. And at the end of that podcast, you'll find out what our next regular podcast on the last Sunday in February will be about. So until our update podcast,
good night out there.
Whatever you are.